Sorry about that. Let me just get booted up here. And we're going to start with the lymphatic system and immunity. This is chapter 12. I'm doing laundry in the background, so you may hear my very loud washing machine. I apologize for any of the background noise that it may cause. Let's start by talking about interstitial fluid. We just got done our chapters on the blood and what the blood is composed of. And if you recall, the fluid portion of blood was called plasma. Well, the interstitial fluid is the fluid that surrounds all of the other body cells in our body. So it surrounds all of the cells except the blood. That's called plasma. It's about 20 liters of fluid that's filtering out of the blood capillaries that makes up this interstitial fluid. This is, again, what surrounds all of our cells and all of our body tissues. It has less protein in blood plasma than blood plasma, I should say. The proteins are just too big to get through those special capillary walls. Almost 17 liters, so just about all of it, is reabsorbed into the venous ends of the capillary, so it gets sucked back up into the plasma. The remaining 3 liters or so is transported by the lymphatic system, and that's what we're going to focus the majority of this lecture on, the majority of that fluid that is not returned to the systemic circulation. So let's talk about some functions of the lymphatic system. It's a very complex drainage system. That interstitial fluid, as I mentioned, is carried through the body. It empties into the veins, and eventually it will become part of the blood plasma. The majority of which transported within this these lymphatic system arteries is lipids, lipid-soluble vitamins, including A, D, E, and K. Those are coming from the digestive tract, and then they'll be dumped into the blood up in the near the superior vena cava, and we'll look at how that works a little later. The lymphatic system works to slow their entry into the blood, so it's going to allow for those vitamins to diffuse throughout the body instead of just being absorbed at particular locations. The lymphatic system contains special cells that participate in the immune response as well. These are the white blood cells that we mentioned back in our chapter when we talked about blood. We're going to get into them a little more specifically here and some of their specific actions. So the components of the lymphatic system include lymph, which is that remaining interstitial fluid that was not reabsorbed by the venous system. The lymph vessels, which are transporting the lymph. There's lymphatic tissue structures called lymph nodes that we'll look at. And there's also lymph organs that we'll look at more specifically. And red bone marrow is also considered part of the lymphatic system because that, as you may recall, is where our blood cells are formed. So here you can see the flow of lymph through the body. Again, it is a very similar setup to our circulatory system. You have a map of vessels leading throughout the body. Of course, the red bone marrow, where all of our red blood cells and white blood cells are made. They're made and distributed through the circulatory system. And then the lymphatic system, if you recall, is going to dump into our circulatory system up here in this superior vena cava area. Whatever's left over in that interstitial fluid at our extremities is kind of sucked up by these lymphatic vessels, kind of like little mini vacuums, sucked up and filtered through these lymph nodes, which are gathered at various parts of our body. And then all of that interstitial fluid is dumped back into the blood plasma up near the superior vena cava. You can also see these lymph nodes, which are scattered throughout the body. They're clustered in particular areas, but they are scattered widely, kind of clustered in the hip area, clustered in the armpit area, clustered in the neck area, clustered in the gastrointestinal area. And again, we'll look at exactly what those lymph nodes do. Let's look at this little tiny diagram up here, and you can see that just this upper right quadrant of the body, the right arm, right thoracic cavity, and right side of the head, is drained by something called the right lymphatic duct. The right lymphatic duct is right here, and it's going to dump into this right brachiocephalic vein, which leads to the superior vena cava. The rest of the body dumps into what's called the thoracic duct, and the thoracic duct is right here, and that's going to drain into the left brachiocephalic vein and ultimately into the superior vena cava. So all of the lymph nodes, all of the lymph vessels eventually lead back to the blood. So let's talk about these lymphatic vessels. The lymphatic vessels begin as lymphatic capillaries. They originate at the tissue level, just kind of intermingled with the blood capillaries, and they're going to carry the fluid that forms there. They're closed at one end, and they're located in between cells. They're much larger than blood capillaries. They permit that interstitial fluid to flow into the vessel, but once that fluid is in, it cannot leave. So the end of these lymphatic vessels have a small valve, just like the valves inside of our veins, which permit one directional or unidirectional blood flow. The ends of these lymphatic capillaries have those as well. There's special endothelial cells that compose this lymphatic capillary, and they overlap like shingles to allow for that interstitial fluid to kind of squeeze into the gaps but not seep out. The lymphatic capillaries then unite to form larger lymphatic vessels, and then the larger lymphatic vessels, of course, are all going to unite to form either that right lymphatic duct or the thoracic duct that I mentioned before. These lymphatic vessels structurally resemble veins. They're a little bit thinner. They have more valves than veins, though, and the interstitial fluid that enters these lymphatic vessels is called lymph. These lymphatic vessels merge to form the lymphatic ducts. So those lymphatic ducts, as I mentioned, are the thoracic duct and the right lymphatic duct. The thoracic duct is the main lymph collecting duct for the majority of the body. This is going to receive lymph from several areas, including the left side of the head, neck, and chest, the left arm, and everything else underneath of the ribs, or both of our lower extremities, abdominopelvic cavity. Everything is going in through this thoracic duct. The right lymphatic duct is just draining the lymph from the upper right side of the body. So let's talk about some of the lymph organs. Our primary lymphatic organs are areas where B cells and T cells will divide and develop. This includes the red bone marrow and an organ called the thymus. Secondary lymphatic organs and tissues are those where most immune responses occur. These would be the lymph nodes, the spleen, and lymphatic nodules. Lymphatic tissue is composed of a special type of connective tissue called reticular connective tissue, and this is tissue that contains many lymphocytes, which are a special type of white blood cell. Here you can see the red bone marrow, as you may recall. Red bone marrow within the epiphyses of these long bones. This is where those stem cells are going to divide and develop into mature B cells and T lymphocytes. The thymus is a special organ where stem cells are going to develop into mature T lymphocytes. It atrophies or shrinks after puberty. In other words, you're born with a fairly large thymus, and that's so that your immune system can develop very quickly as you are an infant and toddler. Then, once you get to puberty, it starts to shrink and shrivel away. By the time you reach adulthood, it's almost non-functional. That's because your immune system is completely formed at that point. Some other lymphoid organs include the tonsils, which include the palatine, pharyngeal, and lingual tonsils. These are basically large clusters of lymphatic nodules. They're non-capsulated, and they protect against inhaled or ingested foreign substances. There's the lymphatic vessels themselves, which, again, they're similar to veins. They have thinner walls and more valves, and they carry that lymph away from the tissues back into the systemic circuit. The spleen is actually the largest lymphatic organ. It has special macrophages, which act like Pac-Men to destroy any pathogens in the blood. It also is kind of the red blood cell graveyard. This is where red blood cells go to die. It also stores lots of red blood cells and platelets during fetal life and helps to produce red blood cells before the bone marrow forms. The right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct are the two lymphatic ducts which empty into, the brachiocephalic and subclavian veins that dump into that superior vena cava to return that interstitial fluid back into the blood plasma. The lymphatic capillaries are going to drain that interstitial fluid from those interstitial spaces, and that fluid again is called lymph. It's mostly made of fatty tissue. Lymph nodes are kind of bean-shaped tissues. They filter the lymph. So special fibers within them are going to trap foreign substances, and those foreign substances get gobbled up by macrophages, which act like Pac-Men, as well as they can initiate an immune response involving lymphocytes. There's about 600 lymph nodes. Most of them are throughout your abdomen and thoracic cavity, near the head, the armpit, and the groin. So let's look at how lymph circulates. Kind of alluded to this before, but we'll go into it in a little bit more detail. So at the systemic level, so within the tissues, the blood plasma is filtered from the blood capillaries into the interstitial spaces, and that becomes interstitial fluid. The afferent lymphatic vessels are going to carry that lymph back into up towards the heart. So they're called afferent lymphatic vessels. Lymph nodes are then going to filter the lymph, remove any foreign substances by filtering phagocytosis and other immune reactions. And that's what this little guy right here is representing, a lymph node. Then you have an efferent lymph vessel, which is carrying the lymph away from the lymph nodes. The lymphatic vessels themselves are going to merge into the lymphatic ducts, which are the thoracic duct and the right lymphatic duct. They're going to empty into the subclavian brachiocephalic veins and ultimately dump back into the systemic circulation within the right atria. Then that blood gets circulated around through our systemic circuit, interstitial fluid forms, gets sucked up by the lymph, so on and so forth. This diagram here shows you a more detailed view of those lymphatic capillaries. You can see those endothelial cells kind of overlapping like shingles, allowing for the one-way passage of that fatty lymph material to get into those lymph vessels, or lymph capillaries, I should say. When the lymph pressure exceeds the interstitial fluid pressure, those cells are going to close tightly. The lymph cannot then escape back, which is another reason why it works as a one-way valve. This animation here goes through the process of lymph formation and lymph flow throughout the body. Let's talk about more specifically those primary lymphatic tissues. Those, you may recall, are responsible for making the cells that perform major immune functions. The major immune cells produced by these major or primary lymphatic tissues are the B cells, the T cells, and phagocytes. B cells, or B lymphocytes, are the cells that are responsible for producing antibodies. Antibodies, you may recall from when we talked about blood type, they're special cells that help protect against foreign antigens. T cells, or T lymphocytes, kill infected cells. So in other words, when your body, and we'll get into this more when we talk about the immune response, when your body is being attacked by a foreign substance, literally those foreign substances, bacteria and viruses, invade your own cells. And so the T lymphocytes kill those cells that have been infected with an invading virus or bacteria. Phagocytes destroy foreign cells, so they're going to destroy those viruses and bacteria. They're also going to destroy any cellular debris. Phagocytes are like the little Pac-Men that float around our blood and lymph and gobble up any junk that shouldn't be there. Lymph nodes are responsible for filtering and performing special immunological processes to remove foreign substances from the lymph. Removal of debris and pathogens from the lymph is going to ultimately reduce the incidence of disease. Once you have protection against disease, you have immunity. So let's look at the structure of the lymph node. You may recall the vessels leading into the lymph are called afferent vessels. Notice that there are several afferent vessels going to this lymph node pictured. The lymph node itself consists of a capsule, which is a dense connective tissue layer, a cortex, kind of like the cortex of our adrenal glands, and then an inner medulla, which is several different layers of lymphocytes and white blood cells. So this lymph comes in from all different directions. Again, those one-way valves, keeping the flow of lymph in one direction. All of the lymph dumps in, is exposed to many phagocytes. It's exposed to many other white blood cells, all eating and gobbling up and recognizing foreign particles. That lymph continues to push through, and it leaves the lymph node in an efferent lymphatic vessel. This diagram up here goes through the special types of cells within a lymph node. First of all, there are lymphocytes. These guys are responsible for participating in the immune response. They're either going to kill the cell or they're going to secrete the antibodies. You may recall B cells secrete the antibodies. Plasma cells ultimately will differentiate into B cells, as we will see, and the B cells will make those antibodies. And then the T cells themselves can help break down and destroy any infected cells. There's also these cells, which are called APCs, antigen-presenting cells. Dendritic cells and macrophages, ultimately these guys ingest or eat those foreign cells and cellular debris using that phagocytosis. So basically anything that shouldn't be in the body, anything that's foreign to the body, dendritic cells and macrophages are going to come and gobble them up. Don't confuse these dendritic cells with the dendrites of neurons. That's not the same thing. In this case, a dendritic cell is only called a dendritic cell because it has all of these kind of extensions on it. It's kind of like a spidery looking cell. It, in fact, is not nervous tissue. So let's talk about the spleen, which is the largest mass of lymphatic tissue in the body. There's two types of tissue within the spleen. There's white pulp and red pulp. White pulp is where the lymphatic tissue contains those white blood cells, those lymphocytes, and macrophages. The red pulp is blood-filled venous sinuses and cords of splenic tissue that contain red blood cells, macrophages, lymphocytes, plasma cells, and granular leukocytes. This is where macrophages in the red pulp remove worn out or defective blood cells and platelets. It also stores about a third of the body's supply of platelets. It also serves to produce blood cells during fetal growth. Here you can see the structure of the spleen. You have an artery supplying the spleen, and then that artery, of course, is going to circulate blood through the spleen. The blood is going to drain out the splenic vein. Here you can see a more detailed image of the white pulp versus the red pulp. The white pulp is where all of those lymphocytes and macrophages are. They're going to filter some bad things out of the blood, any invaders, any debris, any pathogens. The red pulp is this kind of yellower tissue in this cartoon area. This is where lots of red blood cells are. This is where the worn out red blood cells are destroyed, as well as platelets being stored. You can kind of see why one's called white pulp and one's called red pulp. The red pulp is red. It's much more dense. The white pulp is not nearly as dense, and it stains a more purple color, just like our white blood cells stain a purple color. That just has to do with the nuclear stain that's used to image these cells. Lymphatic nodules are special egg-shaped masses of lymph tissue. They're not encapsulated. Many are very, very small, and usually they're solitary. Sometimes they're grouped together like our tonsils. Secondary lymphatic tissues are located throughout the body where lots of immune cells are found. This is where special immune reactions will occur. These include the lymph nodes, the spleen, and the lymphatic nodules. Let's stop here for part 1.